Ferrari is one of the greatest performance car manufacturers of all time, but not every single one of their cars is as successful as the 458 or the 250. Occasionally there are oddballs. One of those oddballs that never gets enough attention, or good attention, I should emphasize, is the underrated successor to the F40, the F50.
Absolutely not.
There's no other way of putting it. The Ferrari F40 is one of the greatest cars of all time. It was Enzo's last project, and it showed the world that Ferrari could still make a fantastic driver's car. But the 90s saw new challengers enter the supercar market, like the XJ220 and the McLaren F1. And with Ferrari's 50th birthday coming up, they had to make their new car legendary. And therefore, they opted for a naturally aspirated V12 instead of the F40's turbocharged V8, for a few reasons. First, Formula 1 was immensely popular at the time, and Ferrari were one of the top dogs. And Formula 1 used V12s at the time, which would be a perfect PR tie-in for the launch of their new supercar. And on a more practical side, Ferrari wanted to enter the World Sports Car Championship again, but the V12 from the 456 wasn't up to par. Unfortunately for Ferrari, the Formula 1 tie-ins for the F50 project would be regarded as nothing more than a funny gimmick, since the engines between the F1 car and the road car were not exactly as blurred as the, say, AMG Project 1, for example. The Ferrari 641 V12 was 3.5 liters and revved to 14,000 RPM. Meanwhile, the F50 engine was 4.7 liters and could only rev to 8,500 RPM. Why 4.7 liters? Because they were desperate to get any torque out of the thing. For context, even with an extra 1.2 liters of displacement, the F50 only made 512 horsepower and a paltry 347 foot-pounds of torque. My Mustang has more than that, and it's a 4-cylinder. It wasn't great. In fact, one of the few time points between the F50 and the 641 was that both V12s are bolted directly to the chassis. Now that's fine in a Formula 1 car, where comfort is not a thing. But in a road car, it kind of matters, and as Jeremy Clarkson pointed out, the engine was bolted basically directly to your spine. So the road car engine wasn't exactly working. It did work for the World Sports Car Championship, though. The 333 SP was very successful, winning 56 races and 13 titles, so the program wasn't a total loss, but still, the road car's engine was a bit lackluster. Luckily, the rest of the car made up for the engine's shortcomings, with an incredible exhaust making a fantastic noise, and immaculate technology. The chassis was carbon fiber, the suspension was double wishbone front and rear, the wheels were magnesium, the whole thing weighed just 2,700 pounds. And it was all of that, with a third pedal and no electronic aids of any kind. And that meant it was ready for launch in 1995, 48 years after the founding of Ferrari. And its premature launch seemed even more premature when reviewers began testing it. Now, I should say, in fairness to the F50, the figures are still respectable, especially for 1995. 0 to 60, 3.8 seconds, quarter mile in 12.1, and a top speed of 202. Not bad. Unfortunately, it was in the same class, and directly competing against the EB110 and the McLaren F1. Both of them had V12s, and both of them were significantly faster than the F50. But even worse, it was off the pace of its predecessor, the F40. So why? Why was the F50 worse than everything else? Simple. The F1-inspired, naturally aspirated V12 made almost 100 less torque than the F40. Even the naturally aspirated V12 in the F1 made 110 foot-pounds more. Now again, I should emphasize, in fairness to the F50, it did have superior handling to its rivals. It was a very good car, had a lot of grip in the corners. But that's when Ferrari's own PR team comes into play for its failure. Because when the F40 was launched, Ferrari sponsored a comparison test between the F40 and the 959 with a bunch of auto magazines. And almost all of them unanimously picked the Porsche. It was a PR disaster for Ferrari, and they swore to never do it again. And that meant the F50 never got a comparison test. You never got to see it go head-to-head against its rivals. And when Ferrari did release information like lap times, they only released 5 lap times, none of which were the all-telling Nürburgring. And when your super fast car that's marketed as a road-legal Formula 1 car-styled thing doesn't get any lap times released about it, that's a red flag, and not the good kind for Ferrari. Because really, the F50 was a flawed masterpiece. If you wanted the whole package, you needed the 1996 F50 GT. It's sort of like the successor to the F40 Competizione. It was a GT race car destined for the FIA GT1 class. The V12 was tuned up to 740 horsepower at 10,500 RPM, and rather telling for how bad this engine was, it still only made 390 torque. But that didn't really matter too much when you got up to speed, especially when the weight was cut down to just 2,000 pounds, and it had even more complex aero. Apparently the F50 GT was even faster than their ultra-successful IMSA prototype from earlier, but ballooning costs killed the F50 GT, with only 3 chassis being completed. And therefore, when combining the F50 and the F50 GT, and comparing it to its rivals, it's viewed as a failure. First and foremost because of its older brother's success. It never lived up to the F40, and it barely beat its performance if it did at all. But there is one thing that the F50 did that nobody talks about enough, one public service that it did. It bridged the gap between the F40 and the Enzo. All of them were Ferrari's Halo cars, and the F50 saw the transfer from turbocharged rally tech of the 80s and the F40 to the naturally aspirated Formula 1 tech in the Enzo. Therefore, the F50 is incredibly important because without it we may never have gotten the Ferrari Enzo that we adore today. The Enzo arguably succeeded where the F50 didn't when it came to implementing Formula 1 technology. And then after the Enzo, we got the LaFerrari, which applied even more Formula 1 technology with the curve system. So the F50 deserves a lot of credit, a lot more than it certainly gets, for saving Ferrari's Halo cars and steering them in the trajectory that they are on now. It's also one of the most valuable Ferrari Halo cars, going for $3 million, a price rivaled only by the 60s Classics and the Ferrari. And also, like the Carrera GT, it's an old-school car that harkens back to the pure driving sensations of old, with no driver raids and a really big engine, while simultaneously using the latest technology to make it faster and lighter than ever. It's truly an important car that we have not seen the likes of since. Well, except for the 911 GT1, and the CLK GTR, and the Ferrari F40, and the EV110, or the F1, or the Diablo.